John, you have really lived two lives, one as a particle physicist and then as an ordained priest. Let's hear something more about the second. I mean, the training. Let's start with the training for the priesthood as compared for the training as a physicist. Can you tell me about the differences?
Yes, well, I went to Westcott House in 1979, just before my 49th birthday, and it was a very funny experience becoming a student again. I was very used to standing up and talking for an hour, and I found it was much more difficult to sit and listen for an hour, and I used to get a bit rested after about 45 minutes. But there were many things I had to learn, and I enjoyed all the courses I went to. I particularly enjoyed the New Testament courses. If you're a scientist, your instinct is to say, what are the foundational phenomena we're trying to understand here? And for me, in Christianity, that's contained in the New Testament witness. So I enjoyed those very much. I had taught myself elementary New Testament Greek before I went to Westcott, and I learnt a bit of Hebrew when I was there, so which was, again, quite useful. Not become scholarly in these things, but to be able to use commentaries that are based on those texts. So I enjoyed all that, and I was the oldest person in the house. I was older than the principal, Mark Santa, and most of my contemporaries as students were talented young people in the second half of the 20s. I felt very sort of aged and wise at times, having all that much more experience of life. But I also lived a double life. I mean, I got tired of being a student all the time, but I could walk up Jesus Lane back to Trinity and turn into a Don again, because I'd given up my professorship. The college kindly allowed me to work my way through Westcott by teaching for Trinity. So I taught, and I remained, of course, a fellow. And so I could have relief from student ways and student food from time to time. And it was a very interesting 2 years. Leading to ordination, and the Church of England believes in the apprentice system still. There are lots of things about being a clergyman you can only learn on the beat, so to speak. I mean, you've learned some theory and stuff. So you have to do 3 years under the supervision of an experienced priest, serve your title, as we call it. And I did most of my title in a large working class parish in South Bristol, in Bedminster. I was glad to go to Bristol, because my mother was still alive, living in Wells, and we were, of course, quite close to her being there. And also because Bristol was the big town of my youth. I'd grown up in Somerset, and I felt returning home, going back to the west of England. And that was a very interesting experience. A lot of the time, you just sort of cruise around, really. You hear old ladies, I'm not feeling very well, you go around and see how she is, and that sort of thing. And what I learned, one of the things I learned from being in Bedminster, our pit was called Windmill Hill, and I hadn't realised that you can have a village within a big city. I mean, Windmill Hill was a working class area, but typically people lived in the house that Mum and Dad had bought in the 30s. It was a very stable community. They knew their neighbours. If the old lady opposite didn't take in the milk, they went across to see how she was. And they also had a very sort of constrained notion of the neighbourhood, really. I remember going to visit an old lady, and she told me, I said, "You got any family?" She said, "Yes, I've got a married daughter." So I said, "Does she live nearby?" And her sort of face fell, and she said, no, she lives at Whitchurch, which was a mile and a half up the road. So it really was a local thing. So I enjoyed my time there. The intellectual side of me really wasn't exercised very much at all. There were one or two people in the parish who were interested in science, religion, things, and of course I would talk to them. But mostly I was just learning the job, really. And after I'd done that, I was licensed to go solo, and I became the vicar of a largish village outside Canterbury called Blean. Curious, straggly place, topographically, because there were various underground springs and things, so you could build here but not there. But very coherent socially, despite the fact that Canterbury was only 3 miles away. The village didn't look down the road all the time. And it was a community, and the church had a real role in that. And so, I would be expected to be at the village flower show. I would go to the pensioners' afternoon from time to time. They insisted on giving me a raffle ticket every time I went. I embarrassingly frequently won prizes in that.
Well, this confirmed your hotline to...
Well, I don't think I could claim that as an answer to prayer. It's a packet of biscuits or a pot of jam. It wasn't anything too exciting. Again, I enjoyed it very much. Again, the intellectual side of me was not too exercised. though part of the agreement was that I would have some spare time to do a bit of writing, and in fact I wrote a book called One World about science and religion, which was my first serious book about science and religion, really, and was quite successful. After I'd been there 2 years, I went to have an interview with Bishop of Dover, who was my sort of boss, really. He ran the diocese for the Archbishop, who obviously had other things to think about. And I talked to him, and I said, I'm enjoying being at Blean, but I'd like in the longer term to find a job which perhaps had a more intellectual component to it, than if possible, in that sort of parish life. And he said yes, he thought he could see what I was talking about. And I thought I was simply making a marker for several years hence. The Church of England is a very odd place. It's become less odd, but it's still quite odd in how you find jobs. Some are advertised, much more advertised now than used to be. But you know, you need to have somebody, a bishop, watching your interests really. And so I thought I was putting up a marker. Within about 6 months of having that conversation, I was rung up by somebody I knew not too well, but a bit, in Trinity Hall, who said, we're looking for a new dean and we'd like to interview you. So I went and was interviewed, and they offered me the job. I then had to make up my mind whether I was going to accept it. I mean, I'd made it clear to them I'd have to think about it, because I'd only been in the parish about 2.5 years, which wasn't very long. And my wife also was very reluctant to leave Blean. She really enjoyed village life. She enjoyed the Women's Institute and all that sort of thing. So I went to see the Bishop of Dover again, and I told him what the situation was, and he said to me, I think you've been offered the job you described to me when you last came to see me, which was a very wise and helpful thing to do. So after a bit of hesitation, I did accept the job, and we returned to Cambridge. And that was funny, really, because we'd been away, I suppose, about 5 years almost, and people rushed up and said, you must be terribly glad to be back, because Cambridge people think there's nowhere else to be. Yes. And I would say, well, it's not quite as simple as that. And Ruth would sometimes just say no. But she reconciled herself to being back here. And I enjoyed Trinity Hall very much. It was an interesting job because it had, of course, a liturgical and pastoral aspect. I mean, I ran the Westbrook Chapel. I did what I could pastorally in the college. I wasn't terribly good with undergraduates. I wasn't in the bar at 11 in the evening, and I had to do what I could, but I had some contacts there, and with dons and the college staff, I had quite a lot of pastoral work of one sort or another to do. And I, of course, directed studies in theology in Trinity Hall, and I had a chance to write. So it was a very, I enjoyed the hall very much. Trinity was large and grand and rich. Trinity Hall was comfortably off, small and domestic, and I really enjoyed they had this very good system. But every Tuesday there would be a dinner for fellows only, and most of the fellows came. It was a real sort of binding occasion. And so I enjoyed all that, and I would have been perfectly happy to have stayed there for the rest of my academic life. But one day, my phone rang again, and somebody I knew in Queens, from my maths days actually, said to me, we're looking for a new president, and we thought, would you like to be considered? So I said, out of the blue, you know, so I thought, well, I can't say yes or no. So I said, yes, I would like to be considered, but again, I will have to think about it very carefully if this becomes serious. And he said, yeah, I understand that, and you understand also that nothing at all may come of this. I said, yeah, I understood that, because colleges obviously look around and so on. So nothing happened in about 3 weeks, and then somebody rang me up. In fact, the vice president rang me up and said, we'd like you to come to dinner, and after dinner to answer a few questions. So I went in, I paid very nicely at dinner, and used the right knives and forks and everything, and after dinner we sat around, and most of the fellowship was there, and they just asked me lots of questions, about an hour and a half. And I thought to myself, I don't know whether this is the right job for me or not, so I felt very relaxed. I thought, I'll just say what's in my mind, and we'll just see what happens. And we had a very interesting conversation one sort or another. And at the end of the evening, I said, thank you very much, and I went away, and I didn't hear anything for another couple of weeks, and then I was rung up again and said, we'd like you to bring your wife round to lunch. And I thought, this is really getting serious now. So I contacted 3 senior bishops who knew me quite well, including the Archbishop of York, John Hepwood. And I explained to them that I might be offered the presidency of Queen's. And I was unsure whether to take that, because of course it's a secular job. Though of course, with the college chapel, and I knew Brian Hebblethwaite, the Dean of Queen's, very well, I knew I would have a role in the college chapel. so on. And they all actually, interestingly, independently gave me the same advice, which was they said that they thought there was some merit in some clergymen holding secular jobs if they had the experience to do the job. And then eventually I was offered the job. And then there was just one final little thing to be sorted out. Queen's of course had double sets, and there was an agitation among the students to allow mixed sharing in double sets, which had not been allowed in college beforehand. And the governing body was about to make up its mind about that. Well, I have my own personal morality is pretty straight down the middle Christian morality. I believe sexual relationships are properly exercised within lifelong commitment of marriage. I realise that not everybody takes that point of view, and I realise also that colleges no longer stand in loco parentis to people. But I thought that, I'm not at all in favour of colleges trying to pry into people's relationships, but I thought to allow double sharing would be an institutional acceptance of something that I personally myself didn't want to sign up to. So I said that I would wait and see what they did, and if they decided to allow mixed double sharing, I would have to say I wouldn't accept the presidency. I didn't try and put any pressure on them. It would be a foolish thing to try in any case. But in the end, they didn't accept it, and so I became the president. That was a little sort of glitch. And then of course we moved into Queen's.
And how long were you there?
I was there for 7 years. We lived in this wonderful lodge. I mean, it really was a lovely place to live in. And we enjoyed that very much. And we had nice staff who helped us with it, of course, as we needed to have. Just after we moved in, there was a census. And the census included also a questionnaire about accommodation. And one of the questions was, not counting kitchens and bathrooms, how many rooms do you have in your house? And the answer for us was 20. And how many people lived there? We had no resident staff. The answer was 2. And you felt a desire to write in the margin, this is not as scandalous as it sounds. But we did in fact use all the rooms. And it was a nice place. I enjoyed Queen's. I think one of the key things in being head of a house is to realise you're not the CEO, that you have to carry people with you, you have to sway the governing body. And I like that. I mean, I'm not a CEO by temperament. I like trying to find consensus between people. Of course, the governing body didn't always do what I thought was the best thing to do, but by and large, we didn't have any sort of pitched battles. And it wasn't a factional college. It was a pleasant place to be. We did a lot of entertaining, of course, and so on. It was satisfying. I wasn't a very enterprising president. I didn't produce any great, enormous change. The college had had a long building experience, building Crips Court and so on, and they needed a bit of a rest from that, which suited me too, actually, though of course I would have tried to do that. And when I'd been interviewed, I said to them, of course I would do what I could for fundraising and be friendly with alumni, though of course I had to start essentially from scratch in that area. I didn't know any old Queen's people. But that I wasn't naturally gifted or didn't have a natural taste for fundraising. Some people like, getting the chap in the corner that doesn't leave till you've got the checkbook out. It's not my style. So they knew that and accepted that. And actually, 2 years after I retired, I retired in 96, 98 was the 550th anniversary of the college. And that was a big fundraising account. And my successor, who is absolutely a natural,
John Polkinghorne,
this sort of thing, really coped with all that, and of course kept very well.
Were you able to do any science while you were?
Well, I'd given up science. I mean, of course, I kept an interest in science. I mean, I read Nature and things like that, and I see the drift of things. I was able to do a fair amount of writing about science and religion. Yes. So that was one of the things I missed in parish. I missed 2 things in parish life when I was working there, which I was glad to get back to when I came back into the academic world again. One was working with colleagues. Of course, you were working with people all the time in the parish, but you have delicate relationships. It's not so easy to say, what do you think of blogs? You have to feel your way about that. And you have a fairly sort of lonely life. I think that's one of the problems for clergy. I mean, I used to go to chapter meetings, the local deanery clergy, and people would stagger in with these enormous diaries as big as gospel books, I think to emphasise how busy they were, and as a sort of justification. So I missed working with colleagues, and the other thing I missed was the rhythm of term vacation. because though term is busy, there's always vacation, and think you can get on with things. Parish life, of course, is 52 weeks a year, chugging away. So, and I did make quite a lot of use of vacation time to write things. But I also, I mean, being the head of a house is not absolutely full time in a sense. It does give you, at least in my experience, it gives you room for some of your own work. And I think it's quite important actually that heads of houses do have some sort of active academic interest. I mean, I don't mean to say it's impossible to have a retired diplomat or that sort of thing, because obviously there have been very successful cases, but it does help if you understand what the business of the community is, really.
Well, one of our provosts at King's was Patrick Braithwaite, a section anyway of the Royal Society, which perhaps leads us off into the question of the Royal Society. And you may or may not want to say anything about the recent dispute about the, I don't know, the pressure that was put on the education officer at the Royal Society to resign.
Let me say first of all that I long to be an FRS, and it took me a little bit longer to get elected than I thought it might be. And I actually say in my autobiography that if somebody has proposed to me some extraordinary plan by which murdering my grandmother would have facilitated my election, I of course would have said no, but there would have been a pause for mental strife before I did so.
Can this go on the internet?
Yes, I think so. Yes. Well, I put it in my autobiography, so that's public knowledge. I'm very sad, really, about this recent episode of the Royal Society with their educational advisor, Michael Rice, whom I know moderately well, and he made it perfectly clear in a letter to the Times that what he had said at this meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science was, of course, that evolution is far and away the best explanation of the history of life and the diversity of life. That creation science is not science and is not scientifically supported. But he also said that if in a science lesson some person raised the creation thing, they shouldn't simply be told to shut up. They should have explained to them that this wasn't the accepted way of thinking about things, but they should be treated with some degree of respect. And that seems to be an entirely reasonable thing to say. But he was the victim of a soundbite culture which somehow plucked out a sentence and in such a way as to twist its meaning. So he seemed to be saying you should teach creation science in science lessons. And of course, if that had been the case, I can see that the Royal would have got rid of him. But they my understanding, which is gossip understanding really, is that the initial stance was to support him, but then some fairly militant fellows made such a fuss that they caved in. And I very much regret that. I think the Royal Society comes badly out of this particular episode.
Thank you. Returning back actually to theology, Queen's is the space between kings and queens, and particularly kings and St. Cats. There's a lane there which I think used to be called something like Whitefriars or White Hart Lane, and there was a pub there that was known as Little Germany. You probably know all this.
Yes,
I've always been struck by how important Cambridge was in the Reformation with Latimer, Ridley, Cranmer and the rest of it. I wondered if you are interested in the history of Anglicanism and Protestantism in Cambridge, and whether you could sketch in anything about Cambridge's role in theology and the rise of Anglicanism.
Well, I'm certainly interested in the history of Anglicanism, and it's quite true, of course, that the English Reformation was largely, intellectually at least, inspired from Cambridge. The bishops you mentioned came from Cambridge and were burnt at Oxford, as people say about these things. And then Cambridge has played an interesting role over the centuries in that respect. I mean, one of the persons who got the old-fashioned natural theology of the going was John Ray, who was, of course, a pioneer of taxonomy. I'd also read a book, The Wisdom of God and the Works of Creation, which was very, very influential. And William Paley, who I suppose represents the peak of that sort of movement, was also a Cambridge man and quite a Christ man. And of course it was another Christ man, Charles Darwin, who drew the rug from that particular form of argument with the publication of The Origin of Species. So there's a whole succession there. In the 19th century, the great strength of Cambridge was in New Testament studies and criticism. Westcott, Lightfoot and Hort were all people of very great scholarly ability, very great scholarly scrupulosity too, and played a very fundamental role in the developing that kind of studies in this country. Somehow the English style of doing that sort of study was careful, but not as sceptically inclined as much of the German scholarship was. So there was a sort of corrective there. And of course, that's continued until fairly recently. I mean, Charlie Mole was undoubtedly a distinguished figure in that respect. So Cambridge has had quite a good record in that respect.
What about the evangelical side? I mean, Charles Simeon and...
Yes, well, Charles Simeon obviously was a very influential figure, and I suppose the KICU has remained an active thing here. I spoke earlier of my undergraduate involvement with it, but with some gratitude and some regret. And as far as I know, that still continues. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things in my lifetime among student Christianity in Cambridge has been the decline and disappear of the SCM, which was the sort of more liberal-minded counterbalance to the Evangelical Christian Union, which turned tremendously Marxist in late 60s and withered away because of that, and has not really re-established itself.
That's this student Christian movement.
Student Christian movement, which was probably about as numerically large as the KICU in the 50s and so on, but it's now, as far as I'm aware, very thin on the ground.
I mean, as soon as one starts thinking about this, one thinks of other the Neoplatonist movement.
But yes, of course, that's also true.
Henry Moore and so on.
Yes.
Must have been very distinctively Cambridge, but also seems to be a constant search for some solution to the problem of threats to religion. I mean, that movement then, and later on with, well, more in Oxford, but C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams and so on.
Yes, I have a sort of some ambiguous feelings about that. I mean, of course, there's powerfulness in that, and the emphasis on a rich view of reality, so that you don't have reductionist views, and you allow a very positive role for the mental and the spiritual. That seems to me important. I mean, Platonism has had an ambiguous influence on Christianity. I mean, it has tended to at times encourage too spiritual view of things. I mean, I think Platonistic view of the soul, for example, a dualistic view of the soul, is not a sustainable option, and in fact not actually a biblical option either. I mean, the most of the writers of the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, I think, saw human beings in the famous phrase as animated bodies rather than incarnated souls. So the influence there is variable.
And another, I mean, it's related to the evangelical, is that Cambridge was very important in missionary movements, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed.
In China and all over the world.
Yes, that's certainly so.
And in this anti-slavery movements.
Well, of course, yes. I mean, yes. I don't know what to say about it, but that's
it's
right.
all true. I've been trying to characterise, writing a book about Cambridge, trying to characterise the feeling of Cambridge. It's very difficult to capture this feeling of constant reminders of something else, of something numinous or religious in the constant rituals, in the constant observances, the chapel services, and the sense of wonder. And yet it's very nebulous, isn't it? It's difficult to pin down. At least I find it difficult to pin down. It reminds me of Japan, which is filled with temples, but when you talk to people, they are a little English evasive about the strength of their religious beliefs.
Well, that can be so. I mean, I must say for myself, I find Christian belief of a fairly orthodox kind. I mean, I can say the Nicene Creed without reservation. Is more persuasive than a rather nebulous thing. I mean, I think that there is a sort of power, explanatory power, and comprehensiveness in a well-articulated Christian theology that a more nebulous spirituality, I think lacks.
Returning to the, these are just sort of
sure, yeah.
afterthought questions I like. Returning to the science-religion controversy, I think you may have said previously that pointed out that many great scientists were
certainly.
Interested. I mean, do you think actually that in the work of people like Newton onwards, religion actually was some put it another way, Joseph Needham in trying to understand why Chinese science didn't develop, and others have suggested one of the reasons may be the absence of a firm, principled, or view of that the universe is based on firm principles, and that Taoism and Buddhism doesn't give that, and Christianity, therefore, at a deep level, was necessary for the origins of, or to sustain scientific endeavours. Do you think there's anything in that?
I think there is something in that. I wouldn't want to make it a total explanatory principle, but I think that if you think of the Abrahamic faith all see the world as having a creator who is rational, and therefore his creation will have an order to it. But a creator is also free to choose the order of the world, and it's not imposed upon him by some world of ideas or something, which provides the blueprints for the demiurge to work with. So that you have to actually look and see what order the creator has chosen to instantiate. And that brings together the idea that there is an order of the world, perhaps mathematically discernible, with the fact that you have to also empirically look to see what that order is. Moreover, of course, if you believe the world to be God's creation, then it is worthwhile to explore it. It is worthwhile to read the book of nature, as the 17th century people would say, as well as to read the book of scripture. And I think all these things do combine together, and they do make it are a part of, I'm sure, were helpful, and provide some explanation of why the ancient Greeks, clever though they were, didn't quite get onto it. Pretty near with Archimedes, but not quite. And the Chinese, with their tremendous medieval civilization, didn't get onto it either. I think there is something in that, certainly.
And what about the suggestion that there's a basic difference between a God of the Catholics who interferes through miracles in nature, and therefore natural laws are rather unpredictable and probabilistic at least, whereas in after the Reformation, the Protestant believe God. I mean, he's the first mover, but after that he doesn't interfere, and therefore science might be more likely to develop in Protestant cultures.
Well, that might be so. I think you neither want endlessly interfering celestial magician at work in the world, nor I think do you want a deistic spectator. I think my picture, supported both by science and theology, is a world of open process, not a clockwork deterministic world at all, but something richer, more subtle, and I believe more supple than that. And I believe that God does act providentially within history, just as we are allowed in a small way to act as agents, bringing about the future. So that was one thing I'd say. The other thing is, the problem of miracle is a problem that, anyway, Orthodox Christian believers like me certainly can't dodge, because the centre of my own belief is the belief that Jesus was raised from the dead the first Easter day. And the problem of miracle is really the problem, it's not so much a scientific problem, but a theological problem, which is that whatever God does, God is not surely a celestial conjurer. So, capriciously doing today what God didn't think about doing yesterday and won't be bothered to do tomorrow. So there's a question of divine consistency is the problem of miracle. God isn't condemned never to do anything new. That's why we use personal language about God. God is more like Father than force. The force of gravity is always the same. It'll never change. But God is more like a person than like a force. And people can do particular things in particular circumstances, and even totally unprecedented things in unprecedented circumstances. And that's the problem of miracle. And that's why, if you take the Christian view of the nature of Jesus Christ, that he is God living a human life, accepting a true humanity, but living the human life, then the fact that he was raised from the dead the first Easter day becomes not a random, capricious act, but a fulfilling and testifying act. And that's the problem of miracle. Miracles are not to be trivialized.
A quotation which I gather you like, and I wondered whether you could tell me what it means, from another great physicist, Freeman Dyson. The more I examine the universe and the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe in some sense must have known we were coming. What does that mean?
Well, I like the quotation because Freeman Dyson is a great physicist, and it's interesting to hear him saying this. What it means is this. We've come to realise, as we've understood the processes of cosmic history, turning the ball of energy into the world we see today, full of rich variety, we've come to understand that though, of course, all that's taking place through a whole sequence of evolutionary processes of one sort or another, nevertheless, its possibility also depended upon the given physical fabric of the world, the basic laws of nature, taking a very particular, very finely tuned form. Only if the laws of nuclear physics lie within very narrow range will it be possible for stars to make carbon, for example, and therefore the possibility of carbon-based life depends upon that. And there are many, many examples of this fine-tuning, the anthropic universe, as people sometimes say, capable of producing creatures of our complexity, is a very particular world indeed, and that's what Freeman Dyson is referring to there. He phrases it in a curious way. I don't know what he means by saying the universe must have known that we were coming. I mean, I think that's a way of avoiding. Freeman has an ambiguous relationship to religious belief, actually. I mean, he would call himself a cultural Christian, but not a fully committed believer. And I think he's just trying to avoid using the word God at that particular stage.
So if you substitute God for the universe, then it would make a little more sense.
I would say that God intended that something like us should be coming.
Another thing which I think is probably a quotation to a certain extent from your work, you say something like, when you turned your collar round, you didn't forego the search for truth, and that the search for truth in science and religion has a cousinly relationship, which is rather a nice way of putting it. What do you mean by that?
Well, I do mean by that the question of truth, first of all, seems to me as absolutely central to religion as it is to science. Well, I understand truth in a correspondence sense. That's to say that matching our thinking and understanding with the nature of reality. Of course, not a totally adequate, not a totally perfect match, but that's what we're aiming for. And that's as essential to religion as anything else. Religion isn't, in my view, a technique for consolation or getting us through life and that sort of thing. It is concerned with the reality within which we live. So the question of truth is important to religion, and as it is to science. And I think in both parts of the quest for truth, we're seeking truth through motivated belief. Religious belief is not, in my view, based on some unquestionable authority, some guaranteed sacred book or whatever that tells you all the answers. It is the understanding of particular events and persons and experiences which seem to be transparent to a sacred reality. Of course, that has to be looked at carefully and so on. And of course, religion doesn't have the repeatable character that the science does. I mean, science has a secret weapon of experiment, but all forms of personal encounter with reality don't have the power to repeat it. I mean, we don't hear the same piece of music the same way twice, even if we play the same disc. We have a different reaction every time. So that's what I mean. I mean, I really do want to approach my religious belief in that sort of thing. I don't want to approach it as submission to unquestionable authority. I don't want to see it as just a hopeful thought. Of course, theology is much more difficult than science. I mean, we transcend the physical world and the biological world and can put it to the test. God transcends us and can't be put to the test. But it's the same sort of spirit, and I really do mean it when I say I don't think that when I moved essentially from concentrating my intellectual efforts on science to theology, that I changed all that much.
When you said we transcend the physical world and then God transcends us, that sort of links to another quotation which I think you like, of Anthony Kenny, the philosopher's. After all, if there is no God, then God is incalculably the greatest single creation of the human imagination.
Yes, I do like that. I do like that quotation, and I think it's justified. I mean, you get someone like Dawkins who tells you how terribly malign influence belief in God has had, and nobody could deny that belief has been misused, has led to inquisitions, crusades, all sorts of terrible things, which religious people must take responsibility and feel penitent. But equally, I mean, religion has been extraordinarily fruitful in individual human lives, in inspiring art and movements to improve human life, and the abolition of slavery would be a canonical example. And it does seem to me that it's highly suggestive that there is some reality behind. The influence is so powerful and widespread and fruitful by and large that it seems to me that it's reasonable to think there might be a reality inspiring it.
It unfortunately just reminded me of Montaigne's remark that if triangles were to create a god, he would be three-sided. In other words,
yes.
the Durkheimian view from anthropology, which is that undoubtedly religious phenomena are very complex and very interesting, but the ability to create many different shapes and forms, which we can find from very early civilizations onwards, I mean, it is to be admired, but it's nothing incalculably more complicated than, say, devising a kinship system or an agricultural system or anything else. It's not incalculably more complex.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I think it is more complex, and of course, obviously, we are going. Human beings are going to have limited imaginative and intellectual resources, and we have to use what we can. I was talking a little bit earlier about using personal language to God, not because of course I believe God's an old man with a beard in the sky, because it seems to me less misleading to think about God in personal terms than it is to think about God in personal terms. And therefore we can't help having some sort of human images. And of course, Christian belief would say that that's not wholly misleading, because there is some analogical relationship between human beings, the image of God in human beings, and the true nature of God. But I don't want to make that an a priori principle. I'd make that a posteriori discovery that there is that connection. We have to use such resources as we have. In physics, we have this wonderful language of mathematics, which seems so perfectly tailored to what we want to do. In almost everything else we try and do, and I think follow quite a lot of biology, and certainly I would guess anthropology, we don't have quite such apt resources to use.
Well, another argument that I think you approve of as supporting the evidence of God is the intelligibility of the universe. That is to say that there's no survival fitness in our ability to understand things like quantum mechanics or general relativity or much of science, and yet we can do these things. Do you think that is a strong argument?
I think it's an extraordinarily significant fact about the world that we are able to plumb it to its depths. I mean, obviously we've got to understand the everyday world, but the quantum world is quite different, and though there are some unresolved problems about our understanding of it, nevertheless we can make a great deal of sense of it. And I do think that's a very, very striking fact about the world. And I think it's... incidentally, I found it talking with non-believing scientific friends, physicist friends anyway, it's one of the things that they are most uneasy about. Well, the fact that the world is deeply intelligible, and also incidentally wonderfully ordered. I mean, not only can we understand it, but we do have this feeling of wonder at the actual order that we discover when we understand it. Does seem a non-trivial fact, as the mathematicians say, about the world in which we live. It seems to be something that it would be rather intellectually lazy to say, well, bit of good luck, and nothing more to say about it. And it is difficult to see what to say about it, other than that it seems to be evidence of some sort of cosmic mind. And people see, of course, there the threat of theism, and that makes them uneasy. But I've personally not encountered a really serious counter suggestion. Of course, if you think that argument is really convincing, it gives you still a very limited notion of God, as a great mathematician or something like that. I mean, I think there's a lot more that we would want to know about God, and we can know about God than that. But at least it sort of puts, if you like, the theistic question on the agenda.
Would you think that if we discovered that there were things that we realised that we could not comprehend, this would therefore be some kind of counter-argument to this? I'll give you an example. When I interviewed Martin Rees about whether we would ever, I mean, I put Stephen Hawking's quotation, we are on the edge of understanding the universe and everything, and I asked Martin whether that was true. He said, well, maybe we'll know in one sense, but what's to guarantee that we will understand what we find? It may be beyond our comprehension, whatever these rules and laws are. The first nanosecond of creation is something we as human beings are not equipped with our minds to understand.
Well, it's a possibility, and I mean, nobody knows how to estimate the probability of that possibility, obviously. Nevertheless, I would still think it's very significant that we can understand as much as we can. I mean, I don't want to claim that the human mind has unlimited ability to understand everything, but it is really quite astonishing, the range of our understanding, and I think that in itself is sufficient to put the question on the agenda. As for encountering limits, well, the only way to find that out is to push the boundaries back and see what we find.
Excellent. Well, those were my supplementary questions. Was there anything else that we?
I don't think so. I mean, obviously one can go endlessly talking about myself, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. It's been a very interesting conversation. I enjoyed it very much, and I'm very grateful to you for laying it on.
Reciprocally.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.